MIcah Parsons, who rumored to be taking on more of a full-time hand in the dirt defensive end type role this year, versus that sort of hybrid edge, gonna stand up and cover and play some linebacker. So why don't we actually start with him there? Because I still see MIcah Parsons going off very frequently as the number one. You can see him over in the ADP. He's number 2 overall defensive player being taken. And I see him going number 1 all the time, especially in sack heavy. But I'm I'm a little nervous this year, man. I don't know about how are you feeling about MIcah Parsons with this rumored like role change potentially?
Yeah, I think he's a player it's very dependent on where you can get him from a positioned standpoint.
Yes.
It's kind of the inverse of some of the, at least to me, like
Yeah.
Will Anderson being a DLN linebacker, like that's a bit of a detriment. Whereas Parsons, I was having as a linebacker who in the last 2 years consistently got a bunch of sacks and had
Mhm.
a decent enough floor in tackles. Looking at last year, 13 and a
Yeah.
half sacks, 65 combined tackles. Previous year, 13 sacks, 84 combined tackles. So pretty consistent stuff there.
Yeah.
Um, you just love his upside in that defense, right? Like he has a very stable role. He's obviously moving around, which makes me a little worried because that's sort of how the Buccaneers handled our good friend Devin White, where it's like you're just gonna be a jack of all trades, which means you can't really rely on him for a whole lot of things.
Right.
Uh, I love him in best ball. Like if he can somehow
Yeah.
fall to you, I'm in some IDP only best balls, and by fall to you, you have to have a top 2 pick, right? Uh,
You're
but
right.
you like absolutely love that. In terms of consistent play, I do like some of the other people more that are around him there. So I I always like hedging. I think he's going to live up to his definitely LB5 uh sort of price tag. Like he should absolutely, based on pedigree and what he's done the last 2 years, be drafted as a top 5 uh linebacker. DL2, you could convince me some of the other people have more stable spots. So depends on where you get them and what you're trying to do.
Yeah. The thing that makes me nervous is so the 13 and 13 and a half sacks, that's staying consistent. But you saw the combined tackles and solos specifically
Down.
drop by 20, which is not insignificant, where he was already this past year sort of taking that plunge into playing more of that dedicated defensive end more than the hybrid edge rusher type role. So that's the thing that kind of makes me nervous. I think that tackle floor kind of took a hit. And unless he's going to give you, put a more like historic pushing 20 sack range, if the sack numbers don't grow this year, then you kind of whiffed on him being a number 1 or number 2 even overall IDP player pick. So that's where I'm just taking a little bit of caution with him. Now, again, I'm not necessarily trying to sell him if I already have him on my dynasty squad, but for startups and for redraft this year, I'm a little more bearish than many who seem to still be very bullish and taking him number 1 overall. So I'm a smidge worried about Parsons this year just from the everything else. And you can see he was no picks in 2 years, only 3 passes defended in each year, 3 forced fumbles. And he did recover 3 last year versus 0 in his rookie year. So he's not giving you a lot of the splash play stuff either. So that's
Yeah,
kind of why I'm throwing up a little bit of a red flag
I
here.
think we know who he is. Like I think
Mhm.
the season we saw last year should be, if that's his average, he's still very good. Like his average
Yeah.
points per
Oh,
defensive end, if you have him as defensive end, he was still the
mm,
third best points per game player behind
right,
only Bosa and Max Crosby, right?
right.
And not too far off from Hassan Reddick and TJ Watt, who are also on our list there.
Yeah.
Granted, Watt had fewer games, but yeah, I think your point is right. Like a lot of people that are still bullish on him, they'd like to talk about upside and all that jazz. But like, well, we have a pretty good idea of who he is as a player. Still very good.
Mhm.
Is he the second overall defensive player that should be taking off the board? Maybe, depending on what your points are set up as,
right.
or I mean, redraft, absolutely. Like you'll take that stability anytime. But yeah, anytime there's variables thrown into
Mhm.
any player, whether it's a new defensive coordinator, a different scheme, or even in this case, he's going to have a different role
Mhm.
on the defense. In theory, we don't know until they're actually on the field. Uh, I don't. I like to shy away from said variability and go with the more stable options.
Yeah. Now the other side of the coin here, and that make me look like a complete dummy, is that if he is dedicating more time, energy, and practice into being a pure defensive end, we could see that sack number skyrocket into the 16 or greater amount, and that's going to absolutely put him at the top of the IDP scores, even if the other stuff stays flat. So that there is that possibility too. I'm more of a pessimist in life. I think he probably sticks around 13, 14, maybe 15. I would be shocked to see him go totally nuclear, but yeah, it remains to be seen. So he's going to be an interesting case study this year. Either people I think are going to be paid off big time by keeping him up there at that number one, number two level, or they're going to finish the year kind of disappointed um, in that level of the draft capital they gave him in their draft.
Oh
So
yeah, as someone with a bunch of Parsons stock coming out of college, ecstatic to see it. But
yeah,
you watch the games and a lot of his impact and why he's so good and why he's ranked so high because how good he is at that job. As a really good defensive lineman, though, that does not always end in sacks. Like he even said it going into this year, I believe already. He's not even interested in getting the sack record or leading the league in sacks, right? Because you
yeah.
watch him play and he's disruptive and
Oh
he's
yeah,
making quarterbacks do stuff they don't want to do. It's like, oh, you are an insanely good defensive lineman, edge rusher, linebacker, whatever you want to call him. But that does not always show up on the stat sheet. And to your
uh,
point, it has the last 2 years, but
yeah,
there's no guarantee that it will this next year. And it's frustrating watching the Cowboys defense when you have him because you want
yeah.
him to get all these sacks all the time. But
Right.
his last 5 games last year, 6 points, 8.75, 18.75, 6.25, 8.25. And I can tell
Boom.
you as someone with him in the playoffs, it wasn't because he wasn't being disruptive and being
Right.
insanely good at what he's being paid to do. It was because he didn't get the splash play, you know? So he does not have the tackle floor as some of these other people do with combined with the what we've seen so far, the sack ceiling to warrant being, you know, that high up. I'm biased. I like him as LB5, DL2. That feels right to me. But I
Yeah,
would not take him second overall.
absolutely. Yeah, I like where we have him in our rankings much more than the actual ADP.
So let someone
So
else figure it out. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.